Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Stephen Kotler is the executive director of the Flow Research Collective and one of the world's leading experts on high performance. The New York Times bestselling author of Stealing Fire, The Rise of Superman, Abundance, Bold, and The Future is Faster Than You Think. Kotler shows companies how to unlock their potential and level up their game like never before. His books and research decode how scientific and technological breakthroughs are radically changing the world for both businesses and individuals, and how to stay ahead of this rapid transformation. On today's episode, Stephen decodes the science of flow, an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and perform our best. We dig into the science of human performance, how to achieve flow, and what it all means for your own life. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to leave a rating or review to help others discover the show. Let's dig in. Here's my conversation with Stephen Kotler. Stephen Kotler, what a treat to have you on, the human performance guru. So thanks for joining us. This is going to be awesome.
Molly, my pleasure.
Let's start here. How much of human performance would you say is mental?
It's an open question. Michael Gervais, who's the peak performance psychologist for the Seattle Seahawks, he's on my board at the Flow Research Collective and is a good friend, has said, and I tend to agree with him, at the elite level, it's 90% mental. And that I agree with, because at the elite level, talent evens out. Yes, you have the LeBron Jameses of the world, but as a general rule, the talent level evens out and the difference is mental. There's a certain skill set that gets you there, but once you're there, it's mostly a mental game.
That's the difference in the top and the rest.
Always the difference.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is, so in the world of peak performance, one of the things we like to say at the Flow Research Collective is that personality doesn't scale, biology scales. And what we mean by that is too often in the field of peak performance, and you see this a lot more in coaching, somebody figures out what works for them and tries to teach it to other people. And most of the time, it is an absolute colossal disaster. And the reason is, what works for me is not going to work for you. Personality plays a very big role in peak performance, and personality is completely sculpted by genetics, by early childhood experience, by things that are locked into place often long before we have a chance to do anything about it. Right? Biology scales. Biology, by its very definition, is the thing that works for everybody. So most of what we mean by peak performance is getting your biology to work for you rather than against you. And to loop it back to your question, the same biology that drives your brain drives your body. They're not separate systems.
What got you into exploring the science of human performance, right? I mean, I know this, but I know our listeners may not, and I love this story.
Yeah, it's a sort of a two-part story. And the first part begins in the early 1990s when I first became a journalist. And action sports were first really starting to capture the public's imagination. So the X Games were getting underway, the Gravity Games, and I was spending a lot of time chasing professional athletes around mountains. I was very interested in those sports. I was drawn to the athletes, and I was spending a lot of time chasing pros around mountains and across oceans. And it was a very strange time. The level of performance kept increasing, staggering amounts. And it didn't make any sense. In like 2 months, stuff that had been absolutely impossible, never going to be done, never going to be done, was not just being done, it was being iterated upon. And this was happening everywhere across action sports. And I was desperate to know why it happened. And a number of things sort of all happened within a very short period of time. One, I had broken if you're not a professional athlete, you chase professional athletes around mountains, you break a ton of bones. And I had broken, I was pushing into 70 bones at that point. 65 of them were all at once in one very bad accident. I spider webbed my legs, but I was a little younger. I was a little older. I'd recovered from that, but I kept breaking bones, and I knew, I was like, look, I'm going to die. Like, these guys are massively talented. I'm going to kill myself if I keep trying to do this, and keep up with them. And I was fascinated by this question of, what does it take to do the impossible? And I decided to take that question into pretty much every domain imaginable. So that's what my career has been, right? A study of scientists, technologists, business leaders, world leaders, cultural leaders, religious leaders, doesn't matter. Every walk of life, I've studied those moments where impossible became possible. And the story you're referring to took place right around the time I was switching my question over, and I got Lyme disease and spent about 3 years in bed and ended up, long story that I will spare you, but I cured myself essentially I was dragged to the ocean. I was taken surfing at a time that I was so sick I could barely walk across a room and was really dying. And over a period of 6 to 8 months, when the only thing I was doing differently was surfing, the doctors had pulled me off meds. They said, there's nothing more we can do for you. I was really at the end of the line, and suddenly through surfing, and I wasn't beginning doing a lot of surfing, I started to get better. But what was happening when I was going surfing is I was having these deeply profound altered state experiences, I now know as a flow state, and I didn't then. All I knew is really strange shit was happening. Time was slowing down, and I felt like I could see out of the back of my head, and I was surfing really well, and like none of it was making any sense, and I was feeling a lot better. And surfing is not a known cure for chronic autoimmune conditions or anything else. So I'm a science guy. So I lit out on a sort of a giant quest to figure out how the hell could these really profound altered states and or surfing, but that was the only thing going on when I was surfing, be impacting an illness. And it led me a lot of different ways, but eventually I started to realize that these states had a name. We called them flow states, and we could talk more about that in a second. But I learned that the neurobiological changes underneath flow, they had a lot of huge impacts on performance, which we'll come to, but they have impacts on your immune system and your nervous system. And an autoimmune condition is a nervous system gone haywire. And as we move into flow, the stress hormones that are in your system are flushed out, and your nervous system sort of resets to zero. Simultaneously, all the neurochemistry that underpins these states boosts the immune system massively. So I solved that puzzle, and at the same time, because flow is a state of optimal performance, what I very quickly figured out is that the same state of consciousness that sort of helped me go from really messed up all the way back to normal was taking normal people all the way up to Superman. And that was where it really all came together and started for me.
Well, and you said Superman, and your book, The Rise of Superman, delves into how athletes use flow to do what you just said, to do the impossible. Why did you choose to first look at action sport athletes and study flow, right? I lived in kind of the primary sports space, but it's interesting, right? You first leaned into action sports.
So there's a guy named Ken Raziza who's at Cal State Fullerton, and he, I don't know if this was done prior to my work or after it, but it sort of answers the question, which is, in normal athletics, flow is not always routine. Depends on the sport. Very common in basketball, rarer in baseball, rarer in track and field. It doesn't show up as frequently in action sports. It's there 90% of the time. And at the time, and this was what really opened the door for me. Scientists have been trying to measure flow using psychological questionnaires for 25 years. My organization, the Flow Research Collective, is working on building a physiological, neurological based flow detector, something that can look at your brain and your body and say you're in flow, you're out of flow. And we're getting, I will say, remarkably close. And we think we're going to have something rudimentary in place, possibly within a year, maybe a little bit more. But so we're getting remarkably close. There's been a ton of work on this, but we're getting closer. But there was none back then. And at the time, It was now I've come to really trust the psychological questionnaires because I've run so much research of my own using them. But at the time, I didn't know how I felt about them, even though they're extremely well validated and everything else. I just didn't know how I felt about them. And we knew at the elite levels of performance with action sport athletes, especially with stuff that was going on because the level of risk had gone through the roof. Most of the time, if they survived the run, meaning they got it, skiers got to the bottom and they were still in one piece, they were in flow. There was no other way to do what they were doing. And so it was sort of a way of saying, oh my God, here's a data set I can totally trust. I can trust these people and I can trust their experiences. And I also have to say simultaneously, I had an early experience. First time I interviewed Laird Hamilton, and we ended up talking about flow, though he was calling it being in the zone. And he had made a lot of comments to me about flow that at the time sounded incredibly new age and spiritual to me. Self disappears, time slows down, all this stuff. And I just sort of dismissed it as nonsense until I started having the experience. And then I realized that Laird was giving me an actual, literal, phenomenological description of how the state impacted consciousness and made him feel. And by the way, I later learned that, the vanish of self and the slowing of time dilation is what it's called, are foundational properties of flow. They're used to define the state. Those are two things that show up, and we understand why that happens in the brain and where it comes from. We even know that time disappears before self, like there's an order to the cascade kind of thing. So there's a lot of work that's now been done on this, but at the time there wasn't that much. And the combination of, wow, I think they're in flow, and their descriptions were so literal and so accurate and were matching the literature so well that I'm trained as a science guy and a journalist. That makes me about 5 times as skeptical as anybody else.
You could throw a law degree into it and you'd maybe top it.
Yeah. So I proceeded very, very cautiously. And I think the reason I got so far in such a different road, it's not like there isn't a whole field of scientific research here, but all the research, most of the research was then being done in psychology. And that wasn't my background. My background was in neuroscience, and that was my deep interest in my knowledge base. So that's how I came at it. I didn't come to the psychology till much later. So I walked in through, what's the mechanism in the brain that makes self go away? What's the mechanism in the brain that is improving pattern recognition and fast twitch muscle response and all these other things that are going on? Those were the questions I was asking.
Well, and I know you've talked about how there's 5 neurochemicals released when you're in flow. So maybe you can dig into that a little bit. You've talked about that briefly, but what is happening in the brain?
So it's not just neurochemistry. Let me give you a quick overview, and
Awesome.
then we'll go deeper. And you tell me where you want me to go deeper. I'll keep it at a fairly high level so we don't drown your listeners in neuroscience. So when we talk about changes in the brain, generally, now there's a whole lot of other stuff going on, but generally scientists are talking about 4 things, which are, you mentioned neurochemistry. So we talk about neurochemistry and neuroelectricity, which are the 2 ways the brain talks to itself. It sends chemical signals, it sends electrical signals between itself and the body, and that's communication in the brain. Or we talk about neural anatomy or networks, which are where things are happening in the brain. Neural anatomy is one place, the prefrontal cortex, the insula. Networks, the default mode network, the salience network. These are whole brain systems, links between areas that tend to co-activate at the same time. And most things in the brain, very rarely is something completely isolated in the brain. It just takes place here, though we believe that for a long time, and kind of the foundation of neuroscience was built on that. And, lately that's changed. So neurochemistry, which is what you referred to, and you're correct. There are 5, possibly 6. Really, there are way more, but we talk about these 6 because they're very potent performance-enhancing chemicals. It's dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, anandamide, endorphins, and possibly and especially in group flow and social flow, interpersonal flow, 2 people in a conversation or a group brainstorming together, or a team in a fourth quarter comeback. That's group flow. And oxytocin, which is the cuddle chemical, it shows up in social situations, and it shows up then. So all these chemicals, they massively boost all aspects of performance, both physical and mental. On the physical side, they will deaden pain. They will increase strength a little bit. They will amplify fast twitch muscle response. They will smooth muscle response, etc. Concurrently, they massively amplify all aspects of large aspects of brain function. And let me just go through the list of the sort of like what goes up in flow. And it's going to sound like a hodgepodge. And afterwards, we can talk about why it's this wild assortment. But we see motivation and productivity jack up some 500% in a study conducted by McKinsey of business leaders. So they found business leaders in flow for about 500% more productive than out of flow. In work that we've done, the Flow Research Collective, and then it matches some other work that was done at the University of Sydney. So we've got independent studies confirming the same finding. Creativity is jumping and innovation is going 400 to 700%. The Department of Defense found learning jumps up 250 to 500% in flow. Positive psychologists are very, very clear that flow underpins meaning, purpose, well-being, and overall life satisfaction is probably the most important element in overall life satisfaction, meaning and purpose and well-being. So the people who are happiest on the planet, or the most, not happiest is the wrong word, the people who are the most deeply satisfied by their life, it has the most meaning, they feel the most overall well-being, those are the people with the most flow in their lives. We also see flow amplify communication, collaboration, empathy, and environmental awareness, which is our ability to perceive the natural world. And it sounds like a wild assortment. There are very specific reasons for why those skills. That's actually a list. So when you talk about cognitive peak performance in the brain, everything I just listed plus flow, that's the suite. That's actually what you're talking about. Let me back up and explain why, because it's actually quite simple, but it seems really weird. So the brain was shaped by evolution. Evolution was shaped by scarcity of resources. When resources are scarce, there's two options. You can fight over dwindling resources, or you can innovate, cooperate, and explore and find new resources. So when we talk about all this stuff that gets amplified in flow is peak performance. We were shaped by evolution for flow. It's how we are shaped to perform at our best. And what happens is the reasons these skills, those are all the skills you need either to fight or flee or innovate or explore. When you say we follow our biology down the path to peak performance, those skills are the suite, because those are the skills that evolution to them, as you've noticed, more of them are on the innovate side than they really are on the fight side. Though I guess if you're fighting between tribes and there's strategy and it's a war, that kind of thing, there's a little bit more going on. But for our purposes, when you talk about cognitive high performance, those are the skills, and that's the reason why.
And there's cycles, right? Flow cycles.
Very good point. We used to believe 20 years ago or so that flow was a light switch. You're either in the zone or you're out of the zone. By the way, let's stop for half a second. Flow is technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, if you're not familiar with the term, it's got a lot of synonyms: being in the zone, runner's high, etc. It refers to any moment of totally rapt attention. We just get so focused on the task at hand that everything else seems to vanish. So that self disappears and time disappears, and all aspects of performance, mental and physical, go through the roof. So there's a quickie definition of flow. We used to think it was a binary, you're in the zone or you're out of the zone. Now we know it's a 4-stage cycle. This is also mapped by Herb Benson at Harvard, not my work, but a good map. And on the front end of a flow state, flow is essentially what happens after you have trained skills so well, individual skills, to learn how to swing a bat. And so you start by just practicing your swing, and then you practice keeping your eye on the ball, then you practice making contact with the ball, and then you practice following through, and then you start to put it all together. Flow is what happens after the brain can put it all together into an action plan that it can execute unconsciously. So before that can happen, you have to load the brain with those action plans. And that's on the front end of every flow state. There is a struggle phase, and it can last a really, really long time, months and months and months, while you're trying to figure out how to solve, how to swing a bat at a ball or solve a problem at work kind of thing, or even for a millisecond. So even if you're, say you're out riding your bicycle and you're mountain biking, and to get into flow, there's going to be a moment where for example, the terrain gets suddenly a lot harder than you expect, and you have to go and sort of dig in. You need what is essentially the fight response. It's a different response from the flee and flight response. They're separated in the brain. The flee and fright come out of the amygdala. The fight response comes out of the thalamus, which is work done by my colleague, Dr. Andrew Huberman at Stanford, who I do a lot of work with. So that response is triggered. So you even if struggle only lasts a millisecond, you're always going to get that lean in moment, that moment where you have to commit to whatever it is. We treat frustration in the general world as a sign that you're moving in the wrong direction. You're super frustrated, you're doing something wrong, stop, regroup kind of thing. In flow, you actually have to bring yourself to the point of absolute frustration. What that means is the second phase is a release phase. Take your mind off the problem. That's all it really is. So people go for long walks. People build, there's research done by my friend Lee Slodoff that says building model airplanes or model dinosaurs or models. Low-grade physical exercise is what you're aiming for. So that will distract your brain but not exhaust you. So you can work out, but you don't want to tire yourself out. Albert Einstein famously, for this stage, used to sail a boat in the middle of Lake Geneva. And funny side note, couldn't swim and was a terrible sailor. So he kept having to get rescued from the middle of Lake Geneva. But he wouldn't give it up because it was so core to his process. Third stage is the flow state itself, which we've talked about. And the back end of a flow state, flow is neurobiologically expensive for the brain to produce. It burns calories, right? And so there's a recovery phase on the back end. And this is tricky, again, there's a lot of leaders listening to your podcast, and leaders freaking hate recovery. They can live with the frustration. They know frustration. You don't get to be a leader if you can't work with frustration. But the recovery phase on the back end is really difficult for most peak performers to shut it down, and you have to. Neurochemicals are multi-tools. They serve a lot of different functions. All 5 of these are pleasure drugs, and they're like flow appears to be the only time you get all 5 at once, which is why flow is considered the most addictive state on earth, or scientists don't like the term addictive, even though it's correct here. They use autotelic, which means an end in itself. But one of the core characteristics of flow, how we define the state is the reward, meaning once the experience starts producing flow, we don't need to get paid. We don't need to be asked. We don't need to be coerced. We will go extraordinarily far out of our way to do it again and get more of it, right? So if you've got a job that produces flow, you're totally set, because now you're literally lovingly obsessed with your work, deeply passionate. In a sense, flow over time is a recipe for passion.
That's cool how you say that. You studied it obviously with elite extreme sports folks, but obviously at a much deeper level.
We started there, but now
right.
We have a study on flow and business success we're running with Deloitte right now.
Okay.
We're doing a studies on flow and gratitude in regular people with USC. So, we do a lot of, and at the Flow Research Collective, yes, we train the U.S. Special Forces sometimes, and yes, we train professional athletes. But as a general rule, what we do is train C-suite executives and the general public. But most of our work is C-suite executives.
Yeah, no. And so tell me a little bit about that and how this applies to people in the business world, because I know so many people listening. I mean, I know what bubbles up for me is, well, how do I get to flow? Like,
of course, that's the next question, right? Like, how does it work? What is it?
And how do I do it over and over?
And how do I get more of it? And
right.
So there's tons of answers. And as you and I talked about off air at the Flow Research Collective website, and I give people URLs later, there's tons of free resources for people. So that's there. But what we do, first, we teach people about the flow cycle, because that's probably the single most important thing we can tell anybody, because it tells you, it's the map. If you're here,
right,
this is what you have to do next, right? This is where you go next. To accelerate your progress through the map, we have discovered, and by we, I'm speaking about the entire field, not just me or my organization, that flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. And there are 22 in total. There are way more, but we've discovered 22 so far. 12 of them are individual triggers, what drives Stephen or Molly as individuals into flow. And then there are 10 group flow triggers, what would drive Stephen and Molly into flow together. And so flow follows focus. It is a state of uninterrupted concentration in the present moment on the task at hand. So that's what all the triggers do. They drive your attention into the present moment. More technically, they drive it one of three ways. They either drive norepinephrine or dopamine into your system, two of the neurochemicals I mentioned earlier. They're feel-good chemicals. They're also focusing drugs. So they drive attention into the present moment. Simultaneously, or sometimes on its own, these triggers will lower cognitive load, which is all the crap you're trying to pay attention to at any one moment. And if I lower the stuff you're trying to pay attention to, if I lower cognitive load, you can pay more attention to the present.
Got it. So am I hearing first step is focus?
First is focus. And so let's just walk through a couple of things that I think are really important for leaders. And the place I want to start is actually not with flow or with flow triggers. It's the place I like to start with our clients, which is on what I call the positive psychology basics. And there's two sides to the positive psychology basics. There's a physical and a mental side. On the physical side, the obvious matters. Flow is a high energy state. So sleep matters. 7 to 8 hours a night is best, just across the board. We just know that. Hydration, nutrition, right? As I said, I'm not an expert in either, but hydration and nutrition matter. And we all at this point have a pretty good idea how to eat right. And when it comes to drinking water, just drink 4 times as much as you think you should be drinking and you're probably fine, right?
Okay, right.
And the final component, and this sounds weird because it's in the physical side of it, but it's that important. It's a basic thing. It's social support, right? Chris Peterson, one of the top positive psychologists in the world at the University of Michigan, has said, you could probably boil 30 years of positive psychology down into the phrase "other people matter." So that's the physical side, let's say. The mental side. Gratitude practice, mindfulness, and exercise. And I could talk about why these things work at length, though there's so much that's been said. But what we say is gratitude practices take about 5 minutes. The research shows you can get cognitive and, more importantly, emotional benefits from mindfulness, respiration-based meditation, basically, with 11 to 20 minutes a day. And exercise, you want 20 to 40 minutes. So you want to exercise. This is for the cognitive side. Remember, we're dealing with mental high performance and what we're aiming for. And the reason these 3 things are so critical, they calm your nervous system the fuck down. These are the 3 things that calm you down the most. So you need a little bit of norepinephrine for flow. Too much norepinephrine, which is essentially what happens when you get anxious. And in the modern world, we are always often anxious. It will block flow. So the reason I mentioned this stuff before we even get it to the flow triggers is you're going to need the physical foundation to be able to produce the energy for flow. You're going to need a little bit of the emotional foundation, the social support, that to produce the energy for flow. And you're going to want your nervous system as calm as possible. So under normal conditions, we say do a gratitude practice, a mindfulness practice, or exercise. Pick one, do one once a day. If you have no time, do 5 minutes of gratitude. And on days you're really stressed, 2 of them. And on days you're in crisis or the world's in crisis or whatever, 3 of them. And then we get to the flow triggers. And there are 10 of them to choose from. And I'm gonna start with the simplest one. And it's so dumb. And you say this to people and they're like, what? Really? So flow follows focus. And the single best thing you can do to massively amplify the amount of flow in your life, unless you are a night owl, and we'll come back to that in a second, is to start your day with 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration devoted to your hardest task, the thing that you need the most flow to do. And usually, and this is really important, you want the thing that will produce the biggest win of your day. You start with the thing that if you do nothing else during the day and you get this done, you still call the day a win. And by uninterrupted concentration, we teach people to end their day the night before with distraction management. So go through all the shit on your desktop, in your office, in your world that could distract you, and turn it off. And when you wake up, don't check your phone. Don't check email or social media. So you want to basically go from sleep to work as fast as possible, unless you're somebody who exercises first. And then I would tell you to exercise first. And then, but still, what you really don't want to do, like your phone in the morning is playing emotional Russian roulette with yourself, right? And so if you can't have anxiety for it flow, right? If you need to, and the reason is because there's a second trigger where you're actually going to have to push on the thing that you're doing really hard. So you can't have anxiety going in because you're literally going to generate it while you're doing the thing you're doing.
Right, because you're going to have a little struggle.
Right.
Sure.
And what we always tell people is so your brain does not multitask. It was not designed for a multitasking. It's a serial processor. It's built to focus on one task at once. It evolved to do that. And as much as we keep trying to train the brain to multitask, and by the way, there is starting to be mounting proof that there are certain people who have either evolved or learned how to barely multitask. I mean, barely, but like you look at the studies and see how much performance drops, and you'll never multitask again.
Yeah. No,
you'll go from task to task, right? It's just dumb. It's just stupid. You're not working with your biology. The brain is built to work one way. Why fight it?
Want to learn how to unleash your potential and reimagine your role as a leader in every facet of your life? Join me live July 21st for a free training webinar, 5 Steps to Unleash Your Potential. Check it out at mollyfletcher.com/huddle webinar.
Okay, so the multitasking piece, but keep going. This is good stuff.
I have to also say, so my brother is vice chair at Lathan and Watkins, and he will often say, "Hey, man, my job is talking to people. That's all I do. That's my job. My job is to talk to people, and I don't even do research anymore into the law because other people are doing that. I'm just having conversations, or I'll get managers who very frequently will come up to me and say the same thing. My job is managing people. I'm not going to start my day with 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration, and I will say, okay." That is a fair point, and we can talk about group flow methodologies and how to trigger group flow in those conversations. But I will tell you, in 30 years of studying the world's best everything, the vast majority of them will start their day with a strategy session. Even maybe it's not an hour and a half, maybe they don't need that long, but they will sit down for an hour, they will block out the world, and they will go through every meeting they're going to have and what does a win look like and what needs to get talked about. And they will plan out and plot their day that way. And there are reasons for that also that have a lot to do with peak performance as well. But so 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration. And I always tell people, it doesn't sound like, what have I told you to do? Eat right, get plenty of sleep, get regular exercise, touch people and talk to people, meditate, gratitude, and then start your day with a 90 to 120 minute block.
Mm-hmm.
And people go, really? Like, seriously?
Give me more.
Right. And there is way more. But if you haven't run that experiment in your life, run that experiment. And I want to go back to one thing I said earlier. If you're a night owl, you don't want to do this in the morning. You want to do this in the evening because you're trying to work in accordance with your circadian rhythms. When the brain can focus the best, you want to. So if you wake up if you're somebody who does this at night, fine. The only thing is, before you go into your evening work session, you got to take a little break from reality and try to actually change your state of consciousness. So that is a really good time for night owls to meditate, even if it's only 10, 15 minutes, or take a brief nap or exercise, or right. You want to sort of shift your consciousness. If you can get alpha, which sleeping will help with, and meditation will definitely do, you're then sort of rebooted, right? You've also reset your nervous system a little bit. That's usually the problem for night owls, is the day gets so frantic that unless they're in a regular routine where they block it off and this is when they start, it's hard to decelerate from the day and focus on a single thing. But that's the only caveat there.
Stephen, what would you tell people that say, hey, this is awesome, like I'm going to lean into this, right? But they're saying, I need to be super, super productive. Like in a perfect world, I want to be in flow more than just the first 90 minutes of the day. How do you tell people how to do that?
Let me give you this last flow trigger, and then let me actually answer that question that way. So the last thing I want to say here is most people tend to have what we call a primary flow experience. The thing that is, for me, it's skiing. I go skiing 90% of the time, I'm in a flow state. Some people it's playing music or drawing or having conversations with their best, whatever it is, right? Playing chess, take your pick. It's usually the thing that you did in your childhood that you loved and you probably stopped doing as you became an adult and got busier and busier and had a family and had responsibilities and that sort of thing. And honest to God, after the 90 minutes of uninterrupted concentration, the positive psychology basics, the next best thing you could do is return to 1 to 2 sessions a week where you devote a little bit of time, at least a couple of hours, to your primary flow activity, the thing that used to bring you the most flow. And here's the reasoning why. Flow is a focusing skill. You are training the brain to focus in a very particular way. And the more flow you get, the more flow you get. In other words, if I get flow while skiing, it's going to help me get more flow while writing. I always tell people the single most important thing I did to advance my writing career about 11 years ago, 12 years, 13 years ago now, is I had always been doing this, but I made it a rock commitment that I never wavered from, is twice a week I hurl myself down a mountain at high speeds. In the winter, it's on skis. In the summer, it's on a mountain bike. But no matter what, I do that for at least, I try to do it for at least 4 hours a week in 2 sessions at least. And it was the single most important thing I could do for getting more flow at work. Even better.
Interesting.
This is Teresa Moble's work at Harvard. So she has discovered that the heightened creativity you get in flow, that 400 to 700%, will outlast the flow state by a day, sometimes 2. So literally getting into flow in your primary flow activity, it's going to extend into the rest of your day. The creativity will. In fact, Patagonia, the outdoor retailer, they're a very high flow company that was built around a lot of foundational flow principles. They have a let my people go surfing rule. Means if the Patagonia is in Oxnard on the Pacific, if there are waves breaking, you can leave your desk, you can leave a meeting, you can leave whatever and go surfing. And the thinking is, who cares if you take an hour off, go surfing, if you come back and you're 500% more productive and you're creative for the next day, right? Like, fantastic. Go ahead, take the hour, take 2. So that's a really important thing to know. And then we start getting into kind of layering in the triggers and ways you approach things and things along those lines. We could spend a little bit of time there and a little time we have left if you want, for sure. But those are like, this to me is the rock bottom basics. And I think of it as sort of a 5-step, it's really a 3-step program, right? What I'm saying on a daily basis is meditation, exercise, or gratitude. Pick one. 90 minutes of uninterrupted concentration, right? That's what I'm saying. And on a weekly basis, twice a week, go do the thing that you love to do most in the world. It really matters. Couple that to a map of the flow cycle, you're pretty dangerous. And for people who want to go a little farther, I mentioned this earlier, if you go to flowresearchcollective.com/flow blocker, FLOWBLOCKER, it is a free diagnostic. We've developed it. It will sort of analyze your life, all the things you're doing. This is the thing you're doing that's standing the most between you and more flow. If you want to go even farther than that for free, you can go to zerotodangerous.com. Zero to Dangerous is my main peak performance training, but we do a free, before we let anybody in the class or anything else, we do a free peak performance consult. We get you on because we want people to come out the other side dangerous, which means we interview everybody. The classes are especially our digital is a different thing, but our live events it's limited. They sell out always, and we interview everybody because we want to make it zero to dangerous. Like, we really, really have found, we put thousands and thousands of people through these programs. People come out, we measure flow pre and post. We're seeing an 80% boost in flow.
Oh, that's awesome. Hey, I want to make sure that we get to your newest book, right? The Future is Faster Than You Think. So tell me, what's the big idea here in this book?
The big idea is the future is faster than you think.
The big idea is in the title.
The big idea.
Well, hell, what are you selling then, man?
Yeah, so right. It's a third in a series of books. my sometimes co-author and really dear friend Peter Diamandis, who's the founder of the X Prize Foundation and the co-founder of Singularity University, where they study exponentially accelerating technologies and their ability to impact the world. And an exponential technology is any technology that's on an exponential growth curve, meaning it's doubling in power on a regular basis. Moore's law, which says this number of integrated circuits on a computer chip doubles it. It's the reason why the smartphone in your pocket is a million times cheaper, smaller, and faster than a supercomputer from the 70s because of Moore's law. So once the technology becomes digital, it jumps on the back of Moore's law and it starts accelerating exponentially. So at Singularity University, they study these. We wrote abundance about how entrepreneurs and small teams were harnessing these exponential technologies to tackle grand global challenges: energy scarcity, poverty, healthcare shortages, education crises, that sort of thing. So many entrepreneurs read the book and went, wow, that's so cool. How do we do it? We wrote Bold, which is a follow-up, and it's a playbook for harnessing exponential technologies and building great companies. What's different now, and what the third book is about, is those formerly independent lines of exponential technology, AI, for example, or robotics for another, are now converging, right? AI is bashing into robotics, is bashing into materials science, it's bashing into nanotechnology. These are all exponential technologies I'm listing. And what's happening is we're getting a whole that is massively greater than the sum of its parts. And the data to that is the rate of technological change in the world has massively accelerated. And the thing is, you can track exponentials. They follow predictable growth patterns. So you can map them out and use those maps to look into the future. Ray Kurzweil is the head of AI at Google, head of engineering at Google, has done the best work on this. And he works with Peters, the other co-founder of Singularity University. And by his calculations, we're going to experience 100 years worth of technological change over the next decade. So roll back the clock to 1920, roll it up to now, and pack it in the next decade. And obviously, there's enormous opportunity here and there's enormous disruption. And so what the book does is it looks at the 11 largest industries in the world, whether it's energy or finance, the state or education or entertainment or retail, take your pick. And we say, what is impacting it and how is it going to change over the next decade? And the short version, and you asked what the book is about, and the book is about how every industry on earth is going to massively be reinvented almost from scratch over the next decade.
Listen, Stephen, I could talk to you forever, and I know our listeners could listen to you forever. This is great stuff. The future is faster than you think. Your newest book, I love it. You rattled off some free resources for people, which is fantastic, and we'll put all these in the show notes. But is there anything else that people can lean into, or how can they find out more if they want to dig deeper on some of this work?
My website, StephenKotler.com.
Okay.
Is incredibly useful, and there's a book page for each one of my books. So you referenced a couple of them earlier. They're all there. FlowResearchCollective.com, StephenKotler.com. That'll go you pretty much most everything you want. And I'm Kotler Stephen on Instagram.
Awesome. All right, so we end with rapid fire. I'm going to fire some questions to you, and you just react. Sound good?
Bring it.
Morning person or night owl?
Oh, morning, without a question.
Morning routine.
I get up at 4 a.m. I write from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. I take my dogs for a hike. I live on a mountain, sort of a gap against a mountain, so I go uphill for an hour. Wow. I come back. I'll usually, depending on what else I'm going to do in the day, but I'll do yoga or something when I come back, maybe, or lift weights. Then the rest of my morning is usually spent running my company with meetings for that. And then I do another writing session in the afternoon. There's other things I do, but that's the basic outline.
What's the book you recommend most often?
The User Illusion or The Song of the Dodo. And I think it's tied between the two.
Okay. What's one thing you can't live without?
Well, this is the same answer I'm going to give you to if you ask me what my favorite piece of technology is. And my answer is always the same. My vocal mantras. They're my skis.
Okay, good. I was hoping you'd go there because
my skis.
That takes you to your flow state, man. That, or maybe your second would be your mountain bike, right?
I would actually I would go with my laptop over my mountain bike because of the writing.
Yeah. That takes you to flow too.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Okay, so the show's called Game Changers. So one last question. Who's a game changer, or what game changer, right, inspires you and why? And they could be dead or alive, right?
So I'll give you one dead, one alive.
All right.
Dead is the psychologist William James, founder of psychology, literally the first American psychologist, taught at Harvard, invented the field, wrote the first textbook, worked 120 years ago, and literally was so ahead of the curve that there's a couple things he was wrong on, but he was so right. And science literally, I call it the 100-year detour. We deviated. Freud came along and said, no, I've got different ideas than James. And for 100 years, we took a detour. And literally in the past 30 years, the world has rediscovered William James and gone, oh my God, he like right on everything. And it's frightening. You can still go back and read his first psychology textbook. It's immensely readable.
That's
incredible. He's a very good, talented writer. And he's just right on. Living, I got to point to, I'm either going to point to my wife or to Peter Diamandis, my co-author. And I'll probably point to Peter more so because Peter taught me more than anybody else taught me that I always say that the main difference between somebody who can accomplish the impossible, that people who accomplish the impossible and everybody else, there tends to be sort of three differences. And I'm not going to talk about one of them because we'll get into details, but two of them are the amount of flow in your life and the size of the vision. And Peter taught me that a thing about the size of the vision. Because when I met Peter, he was this crazy, wild-eyed dude who had this idea for the X Prize. He was going to unlock the space frontier, create a private space industry, put NASA out of business, blah, blah, blah. And it was the craziest dream I'd ever heard in my life. And then 8 years later, it was a reality. And 8 years after that, space was $1 billion private industry. It's important to have somebody in your life who forces you to think so much bigger than you would normally. So with my staff, as a result of Peter, almost every meeting we have, when we have a full meeting, and especially when it's just the core team, I always ask, are we going big enough?
Yeah.
Can we go bigger?
Stephen Kotler, this is fun. This is good stuff. This is going to help a lot of people. Thank you so much for taking so much time.
My pleasure.
Out of your, this is awesome. This is going to help a lot of people. Stephen Kotler, thanks so much.
My pleasure, Molly. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.